Welcome to Cyber Leaders with me, Ciaran Martin.
And me, James Line. Now, we're both from the SANS Institute who are kindly backing this podcast. I myself am a techie, a kind of massive geek that has spent my life chasing cyber criminals around the internet.
I'm not a techie, but I did chase cyber criminals and others around the internet, dealing with security policy and operations in government, and I set up the UK National Cybersecurity Centre. But now James and I together are trying to unpack the weird and wacky world of tech security and all the complicated things it involves.
That's right. This podcast is a voice for security leaders. We want CISOs, security directors, and beyond to build up their knowledge of what works, of what doesn't, and ultimately secure their organizations more comprehensively and quickly.
Now, we're in my territory today, James. You're the geek. I'm the sort of wonk. And in season 1, we talked an awful lot about two massive issues that are always on the mind of our CISO community and other cyber leaders.
Well, you seem to have lost the ability to count, Ciaran, because we did more than 2.
All right, but stop nitpicking. I wanted to refer to two among those that we actually talked about in the comprehensive tour de force that was season 1.
I love tour de force, but Ciaran, you're being a little silly now. Which 2 are you talking about?
I am being silly. So what you're asking is which of your new T-shirt collection are you going to have to go back to pick out of our podcast drawer of T-shirts?
That is correct, yes. For new listeners, for context, it's a running joke when someone says something interesting and soundbite worthy, and that happens quite a lot. I usually say I'm going to turn it into a T-shirt, although for season 2, it might actually be a vest, perhaps a muscle vest or something. Anyway, I've never done it yet, but it's not too late yet, is it, Ciaran?
No, but you lost me at muscle vest. Anyway, maybe we'll have to challenge our guests to come up with something worthy of a T-shirt or maybe a muscle vest. Who knows? Now look, back to topics. So in season 1, we talked a lot about ransomware and we talked about cyber as a national security threat. A lot, maybe not as much, but a fair bit.
We did indeed.
And today we have an amazing guest who can not only talk about both, because not only is he one of my favorite scholars of cybersecurity and cyber operations, but he has put together ransomware and national security in a brilliant new book.
What a set of topics. That sounds highly intriguing. What's the book called, Ciaran? And who's our guest?
Well, the book, it's a great title, Ransom War. See what he did there?
Ba-bum, I like it.
So it's Ransom War, How Cybercrime Became a National Security Threat.
Very Ron Seal. That sounds exactly like it does what it says on the tin.
It does indeed. So the book, Ransom War, has just been published, and I'm delighted to say that its brilliant author, Dr. Max Smeets, is with us today.
Hello, Max. A pleasure to have you with us.
Thanks so much for having me. I've been listening to a couple of episodes from the first season on my commutes, so it's a real pleasure to be joining you for the second season.
Only a couple, well, you've got 6 more to go, so you can come back and give us feedback on those. But look, let me do a better introduction to Max before we talk about his brilliant book and his other work. Now, Max is from the Netherlands. He studied and taught here at the University of Oxford, where I'm speaking to you from. And he's currently senior researcher at the Centre for Strategic Studies at ETH Zurich in Switzerland, one of the best places in the continent for cyber scholarship. And he's co-director of Virtual Roots. So first question, Max, tell us what Virtual Roots is and how does it play into discussions about cybersecurity?
Yeah, Virtual Roots is a small think tank. Actually, the name that we had last year and the years before was European Cyber Conflict Research Initiative and the European Cyber Conflict Research Incubator.
That's not a catchy name, Max. That wouldn't go on a T-shirt, FYI.
Exactly. That's why we felt we had to rebrand. And we were also doing a lot more activities going beyond cyber conflict and research. We have a fellowship program. We have a research and advisory initiative. We have an educational program that we run together with Google.org. Occasionally, we run conferences, including last year with Ciaran in Oxford. And we run Binding Hook, which is a media outlet on tech and security.
Yeah, we had a fantastic session in Oxford with ECRI, as we grew to call it. But I have to say, Virtual Roots, much better, but one of the best events on cyber and military operations and cyber and global security I've ever been at, really well attended. And I should say, getting back to the book, Ransomware is the latest in a series of really excellent books and articles by Max on the whole field of cyber operations. And I think, Max, you might disagree, but I think going into ransomware and cybercrime, it's a bit of a change of direction for you. Is that right? Because up to now, you've mostly written about nation-state operations. Can I even use the phrase cyber war? Is that allowed? You've written a very good book. It was called No Shortcuts, and that's about how states all over the world, but even here in the West, and as well as more authoritarian states, how they use cyber power, how they organize their cyber operations. So you've done a lot of study on that.
Well, Ciaran, given all that, I think you've set me up to jump in with my first nice, easy, rather substantial question.
Go on then.
Okay, Max, just really basic one to get started. Is there such a thing as cyber war? And if so, what is it?
So I'm normally not someone who uses the term. I try to avoid it. And that's because I really have focused my attention a lot more on cyber activities below the threshold of armed attack and showcase that these can still be strategically meaningful, especially if they take place for a longer period of time. And if we think about the accumulative effects, you can think about Chinese IP theft or Russian cyber-enabled disinformation campaigns. But then, when I started writing this book on ransomware, I definitely felt you could use the term ransom war. And I guess, you can use the term cyber war. It may be a good question for a trivia night to ask people, when was the first time in history that a country formally declared a state of emergency and a state of war after a cyber attack? And that was in May 2022, after the president of Costa Rica declared it.
Thank God you answered that. I thought you were going to ask me.
I was getting nervous too, Ciaran. I was thinking, I could think of a few examples.
Sorry, Costa Rica 2022. Keep going.
This was in 2022 when the president of Costa Rica issued an executive order in response to a ransomware attack by a group called Conti. And the year of 2021, the year before that, it was the biggest ransomware group out there. So it wasn't a state attack, even though we have seen all these rather significant disruptive and destructive operations over the years, going back to, 2008, 2009.
Really, really interesting. And it's fascinating, we'll come on to this, that it took a criminal cyber attack to provoke the first ever declaration of a state of emergency following a cyber attack. But look, here's another perhaps more difficult topic for all sorts of reasons. Sadly, there's a real war going on in our continent, in Europe, and there's a big debate on cyber operations in the war in Ukraine. Some people say they're really important, they're just a bit invisible. Others saying it's all hype, cyber power, cyber war, whatever term you want to use, was overrated. And this is a horribly 20th century war with all the tragic visibility that would have been recognizable to, say, a Churchill. So where do you stand on the debate about cyber and the Ukraine war?
Yeah, it's been quite fascinating to follow and see the evidence emerging about different cyber operations in Ukraine. We've seen different phases of Russian operations against Ukraine. Early on, Russia was very prominent in conducting what we call wiper attacks. Wiper attacks are data-destructive malware, using this quite in a lightweight manner, so easy to use wipers that they could almost essentially throw away after used once or twice. Very different from some of the activity we saw prior to the further invasion of Ukraine. They're trying to keep up with the operational tempo of the war. Now, as the war has continued, we see Russia actually changing its activity, focusing much more on espionage activities or other information gathering activities that can help them in some of their kinetic strikes. So you see them a lot more targeting, for instance, CCTV cameras across the borders that then can give them a better understanding of artillery units from Ukraine. And, there is, a bit of learning going on the Russia side as to where and when cyber operations can be more or less effective. So clearly, cyber, has never been, and we should have not expected it, as a sort of singular activity that we would see in a war of this kind, but it has definitely played a role in enabling other operations on the ground. The question for the future is whether we have here to analyze. Early on, the Ukrainian government was a lot more willing to share about cyber operations in Ukraine, and also a lot more private sector entities would be writing reports. Perhaps a bit of a quid pro quo, because the Ukrainian government was receiving, especially initially, a lot of free services from some of these entities and was willing to share a bit more. They've become a bit more closed. And today, you don't see the Ukrainian government being as willing to share some of the incidents that are taking place. So I guess the information gap was already there at the start, but has definitely increased as the war has continued.
And Max, I think some of that may be the pressure of just the continued operations and the time available to share, because of course, those folks are continuing to execute and be under the duress of day-to-day operations, and it's tiring. One thing I will mention as a shameless but non-commercial plug, we've a couple of times had folks from Ukraine, kind of frontline cyber defenders, present at the Cyber Threat Conference, which SANS runs with NCSC. It's worth going and looking up those talks on the website, because they're really interesting insights that align to what a lot of what you're saying. But I think your description of cyber operations as a strong supporting capability to Kinetic is right at the moment. And of course, we must continue to evaluate that for the future. But to keep going on this, Max, if I may, so governments everywhere are talking about enhancing their cyber capabilities, defensive, offensive, and more. The Americans under President Trump are talking about going on the offense, which I think to many of us is quite amusing and bemusing because I'm pretty sure they've been on the offense for a while. So they're going offensive-er.
Yeah.
But your book says states struggle to build up military cyber capabilities. So are they any good? Are we wasting our time? Is this an area worthy of focus, do you think?
Yeah, the book started really with a dual observation. So the first observation was that since 2010, we saw this growing militarization or institutionalization of this space, where a growing number of countries were establishing cyber commands, were declaring cyberspace as a domain of warfare. And, we're going out there to say that they could potentially conduct these cyber attacks. At the same time, when we look at the actual number of countries that have been conducting cyber attacks, especially on a repeated basis, especially in the NATO countries, that's a relatively small group of countries. Now, from that observation, there is this question of why is that the case? And that might be partially the case because of motivations and the opportunities out there to do it. But what I've also come to realize is a capacity question too. Many of these cyber commands that were established with not really a peacetime mission. They could only operate in wartime, and even to operate in wartime, they needed often parliamentary approval. This is something you will see in the Netherlands and Germany, and this is the way that most militaries operate. Now, the problems that sometimes creates is that, first of all, they don't get very often this parliamentary approval. Let it be, if at all, once every 10 years. Now, and there's still a question on how do you recruit, train, and keep all of these great people that you're seeking to put in your cyber command. And this is one of the key, amongst many other challenges, that cyber commands face today, where if you are then limited in peacetime and constrained in that way, can you then just operate on a cyber range? And will it be sufficient? Or can I get my operational knowledge that is often also tacit knowledge, right? This is this type of knowledge that cannot be, easily transferred through books or lectures, but the one that you need by sitting, next to someone and doing it together. To what degree can you get this somewhere else by quite literally what some have done in doing internships in the private sector or trying to collaborate with the intelligence services. And this is a problem you see, again, across NATO countries, with a few exceptions. And the US, particularly from 2018, has changed its position. Indeed, you could say has gone a bit more on the offense with its vision of persistent engagement and defend forward, where it seeks to contest adversaries wherever they maneuver. Another country where we have seen a change in stance is the UK, with the more recent establishment of the National Cyber Force. That is quite a unique entity because it brings the intelligence service and the military service under one entity.
I think that's really interesting, Max. And I love this continuous engagement wherever they are as a mental model. I think what you're describing here, whilst we're talking at the level of states and policy, military cyber capabilities and long-term investment, is a replay of something we all have to be mindful in the cybersecurity industry. And even a bit of a cliche you will have heard many times. The last time that you want to learn a lesson in cybersecurity is in the middle of when you need to apply that lesson. We always say the time that you don't want to learn how to run an incident is in the middle of an incident. The time that you want to learn about, how you need to deploy cyber capability or spend or need a certain kind of forward capability is when you suddenly need it. So there's a kind of strong preparatory element that you mentioned where you want to develop this stuff before you're at the point of actually having to use it. So I think whether you're a nation state or you're a CISO worrying about incidents, this kind of thinking ahead, practicing in advance, developing the skills is pretty critical, or it's all done under duress and panic.
Absolutely. And there's a big difference, right, when you say about developing capability, when we think about developing missiles who can lay on the shelf and do not get bored, or developing skills where people, will not be sitting there and waiting until they finally are needed, but they want to constantly hone those skills and also use them in the meantime.
So this is absolutely fascinating, Max, and I should make clear that we are mostly talking about your previous book, No Shortcuts, about military cyber and state cyber capabilities. We'll have to get on to talk about your new one in a minute. But before we do, I'll try a segue. I'm hopeless at segues. But anyway, before we do, we've talked so far about essentially great power rivalry and how cyber fits into that. We've talked about the horrors of the Ukraine war and so forth. But for listeners who are cyber defenders in organizations, in businesses, retailers, critical industries, public authorities, whatever it is. So they'll worry about ransomware, they'll worry about cybercrime, scams, data breaches, all the sort of weird and wacky difficulties that CISOs and others have to deal with. And then we've got your fascinating sort of geopolitical scholarship. But to what extent is this relevant to them, and what should they worry about from all this? Is it what you might call the not pettier risk for those who are unfamiliar with that? The 2017 Russian attack on Ukraine that was completely out of control, similar to the WannaCry North Korean attack. So you're hit at random, or is it more targeted? It's all tied up in global politics. So what can someone listening to us who's, say, working at a food retailer or a publisher or a healthcare system, should they ignore this or should they worry about it? And what could they do about it? Nice, easy one.
Yeah, they certainly are vulnerable to this self-propagating malware we have seen indeed with WannaCry and NotPetya. And that's a significant risk to them, adjacent to the risk of ransomware. When it comes to more targeted attacks, you could say that no one is immune, but of course, some sectors and some entities are more likely to be targeted than others. If you are ASML and you're running a chip business, you have to worry a lot more about Chinese IP theft than some of your colleagues who are selling the latest recipe for your crisps.
Yeah.
Even though I'm well aware, Ciaran, that crisps are important and need to be protected too.
We have our t-shirt, crisps are important and must be protected too.
We could even have a picture on that t-shirt.
But they're not as important as ASML chips.
Very good.
And for American listeners, we'll do the whole crisps and chips don't mean the same thing, or they sort of do. Anyway, sorry, Max, back to this threat and the corporate defender.
No, and so the risk level, inevitably differs across different sectors when it comes to specific type of threats. And that's something to take into consideration there. But if I would be the ordinary business, I would be definitely, as the track record has shown, be primarily concerned about ransomware activity that we have observed, sadly, from 2018 in particular.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Well, Max, that does rather seg nicely into your new book, doesn't it? So tell us how and why ransomware has become a national security threat. Aside from being greatly irritating and causing lots of fraud damage and causing me to have to do much more reverse engineering than I ever wanted to. But tell us specifically about how it's escalated to this level.
Yeah, so why it is really because of both the volume of activity that we have seen, particularly since 2018, and the scale of those operations, right? We now see ransomware activity happening on a day-to-day basis and sometimes leading to national security responses where, for instance, in the UK, you have the COBRA meetings, the National Security Emergency meetings. And a few years ago, the majority of those national security emergency meetings were held for ransomware, more as a result of that than any other national security issue. And when these operations take place, at times they have really severe consequences, whether this is a healthcare institution or even just a primary school during exam week, can really disrupt people's daily lives. And of course, this has led at times to some really sad stories where people's personal lives have been at risk. So I felt from those two things, it was really worth looking at it. And the history of ransomware showcases how this has come about, and has essentially come about through a number of different steps. Early on, you saw ransomware improving in its encryption mechanism, so it became harder and harder to find a decryption key yourself or develop a decryption key yourself after you were hit. Then you saw ransomware being supercharged in two ways. First of all, you saw ransomware groups relying on botnet infrastructure that allowed for much wider set of targeting. And you saw them using cryptocurrency, most prominently Bitcoin, for much more global transactions. The next stage, it was one where ransomware was starting to specialize in different type of activities, where some people were developing specifically the locker, the encryption device, and the decryption device, and others were actually doing the operations, developing a ransomware as a service economy that actually further specialized over time. And then more recently, we saw ransomware groups focusing on ever larger entities, but also starting to think about multiple forms of extortion, moving beyond just encrypting people's systems or data, but also starting to demand a ransom for not uploading this data online and potentially doing any follow-on activity, maybe be DDoS attacks or using the compromised email accounts to conduct follow-on activity against other entities as well. So it's been an evolution, or perhaps even, it's a strong word, a revolution, considering the speed in which this development has taken place in just the last few years.
You said something absolutely fascinating there, Max. I just want to make sure I've got it right. It's one of those obvious when you think about it statements, but it wasn't just Costa Rica. You're saying that in terms of cyber incidents, national security, emergency councils, situation rooms, whatever, have been convened more for ransomware than any other form of cyber attack. Did I get that right?
That's correct. And,
Wow.
the source for that is from The Record. Alexander Martin has reported on this, I believe, now 2 years ago. No, it might be also a reason for the fact that, 2, 3 years ago, the right response mechanisms were not yet put in place for ransomware, whereas they may have already existed for some other types of national security threats that were out there for a longer period of time. So it meant that this board had to convene as a result of that more frequently. But nevertheless, it's a strong statement about to what degree ransomware has risen to the level of prominence for, of course, not just the UK government, but any other government in the world. And it was the reason why in 2022, when I finished No Shortcuts, when I focused on military and intelligence operations, I was like, I could write another book on that. But actually, I should focus on ransomware-related activity, crime-related activity, or primarily crime-related activity, even if this is by some people in the policy community looked down upon, because sort of that's not the cool, great power dynamics that you could look at. These are just cyber criminals operating from Russia and some other countries.
Absolutely fascinating, and great shout out for Alexander Martin's work. And thank you for another podcast guest suggestion. Alex, if you're listening, come on the show. We want to hear more about this. Brilliant. James.
It's an implied verbal contract to this point, Ciaran.
It certainly is.
But look, it's fascinating to me. We talked about ransomware a lot in series 1, and rightly so. It, as you're articulating, continues to be a hugely impactful threat in conventional fraud, in unintended life and limb consequences in some cases intended. We talked about a hospital where the actual cancer patients were being targeted by the cyber criminals, not just the institution itself. And I just find that really jarring, having started in malware, where ransomware was sent to our labs to reverse engineer as kind of an academic, interesting exercise. And here we are, for me, 20 years later, with it being one of the most ubiquitous threats spanning multiple gains for the cyber criminals. But Max, let's narrow down in on an area here before we jump away from ransomware, because we can't spend all our time there. Healthcare. I mentioned the life and limb thing. One of the arguments you make is that ransomware is a national security threat because of its impact on healthcare. We talked about it in series 1. It was pretty bad. How bad is it now?
I mean, yeah, listen to the episode of Jen Ellis, who also talked about these devastating human consequences. I mentioned another example in my book from the Lehigh Valley Healthcare Center, where after the healthcare institution didn't pay, the ransomware group started to leak the photos of female breast cancer patients. These are really sad cases. When you look at it in the aggregate, it's an interesting stat that in the US, hospital volumes dropped by around 17, I believe, to 25% following a ransomware attack for a considerable period of time. And that is subsequently then associated with quite a bit higher in-hospital mortality rates. So it showcases that this is a sort of systemic phenomenon that you see across the country in quite a few cases that this research has analyzed, and that is not just a sporadic incident. It goes to the heart of ransomware, of course, because they go after entities that are most vulnerable, because the most vulnerable are most likely to pay. And in the US, healthcare institutions are in this particularly notable category where they are both vulnerable, but some of them actually do have significant financial resources too that can help these ransomware groups and what they're ultimately after.
Well, look, we will come back to that and what we can do about this, but I want to switch to question of geography. Now, don't worry, we're still on the right podcast. It is about cyber. But the great Dmitry Alperovich, co-founder of CrowdStrike and now writing books and running think tanks about cybersecurity, he always used to say famously, we don't have a cyber problem. We have a Russia problem, a China problem, an Iran problem, and a North Korea problem. And there's some people that say ransomware is kind of a Russia problem, that it's a safe haven. There are all these studies that roughly say, you'll know better than me, but 3/4 of the Bitcoin or other cryptocurrencies go to Russia. And that this only works because these people, Alexander Martin, Joe Tidy of the BBC have done this work where you see all these Russian criminals openly flaunting their wealth, seemingly immune from the police. So is this a Russia problem? Does anywhere else matter?
So in some ways, it has become more of a Russia problem, and in some ways, it has become less. And the war in Ukraine plays an important role here. So the group that I looked at most deeply is Conti, and it was the biggest ransomware group in 2021. And I was able to look at this in quite a bit of detail, as have some others done, because all of their Jabber and Rocket chat messages got leaked, or many of them. So these are sort of their internal WhatsApp chat messages. This gives you a good understanding of how this group operates. And what you see here is a group that has people working in different parts of the world, primarily Russia, yes. But another entity where they seem to recruit a lot from is Ukraine.
Right.
And you saw many of these groups actually operating where, as long as you are Russian speaking often and were in this space for a long time, and Ukraine has been a hotbed for cybercrime for a very long time. Another good person for the podcast would be Jonathan Losthouse, who has written a book on this.
Yeah, very good suggestion.
These groups were to some degree multinational. But then following the further invasion of Ukraine, we saw groups partly nationalizing, not completely, but partially. And Conti is an example of that. It's because a Ukrainian researcher going by the name of Danilo, pseudonym, leaked all of these messages online because this person was disgruntled or, more than that, was extremely angry about all the tanks rolling across the border.
Yeah.
And what has led the further invasion of Ukraine to happen as well is, on the one hand, Russia being less keen to collaborate with the law enforcement agencies in the West, but equally Ukraine being more willing to act on some of those requests coming from Western entities. And so we have seen actually more arrests in the last 1.5 years than we saw in the period before that. So in that sense, you could say, hey, we've seen ransomware becoming more of a Russia problem or more of a Russian-Belarusian problem than it was prior to 2022. Now, at the same time, we have to be aware that ransomware is still a global phenomenon. We see other groups operating across the world. A well-known group is called Scattered Spider, where we have seen as a result of it all arrests across the world.
Yeah.
Plus, we have to think about some of the other countries doing ransomware. And the one that stands out is North Korea, where you seem to have state-linked actors that might not do ransomware across the entire attack chain, but they might insert themselves in part of that attack chain. So you might have North Korean state actors that do the initial access for Russian criminal groups.
Mind-blowing. Wow.
And that is a phenomenon that is, quite remarkable.
Yeah.
And suggests that ransomware should be viewed in a more global mindset.
Wow. Brilliant. Thank you.
Yeah, that complex web of interactions of different state actors. And as we've talked about on the podcast previously, the use of state actors, with plausible deniability, contracting criminals into the chain, there's this complex web. It really does start to paint this picture of where all this innovation and kind of evolution of tactics is coming from, if you just think about it in standard free market kind of innovation terms. But Max, you touched on something I love. We stated one of the things we want from this podcast is to make life a little bit harder for cyber criminals. We love it when people walk away with tactics and things they can use. So let me ask you a bit more about responding to all of this, because you touched on it a little there. So we've had law enforcement with some, arguably a lot of justification, proudly announcing all these great takedowns they've done. Lockbit, owned by Britain's National Crime Agency, with partners. We've seen, in fact, marketing-like websites with cool promo videos showing the inner workings of the tactics with a lovely dance background track, I have to say. There have been others too, but we still have ransomware. So are these things effective? Do takedowns matter? Give me your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I certainly don't want to belittle the enormous amount of work that governments have done across the world over the past few years, across, again, the entire attack chain, from simply putting out warnings about the type of TTPs that ransomware groups are using, to thinking about how they can disrupt their botnet infrastructure that multiple ransomware groups rely upon, to taking down an entire group or going after their money mules or going after their cryptocurrency tumblers. We have seen a lot, combined with focus on going after specific individuals, putting out rewards, sanctioning them. But you're right, it's an open question on whether the numbers have reduced as a result of it. One thing they have certainly done, and we tend to forget this, they have definitely had an impact on the ecosystem and changed the market structure. And we have to keep that in mind. So it's not whether the numbers have gone down or not. It has changed the way in which ransomware groups operate today. If you are a group in 2020 and 2021 and 2022, and you're the biggest one, you can expect the big law enforcement agencies to come after you. They have limited resources. They have to make a decision as to who they are going after and who do they pick. Well, they try and go, if they can, after the biggest one because that's the biggest impact on the ecosystem. But what it has led to is a very different ecosystem today than a few years ago. A few years ago, this ecosystem was one in which we had a big group like Conti that was almost, I wouldn't say a monopoly, but had 80% of the market share when you look at simply the amount of cryptocurrency that were moving towards their wallets. Today, you see a much more dispersed landscape of different groups. And you see even splinter groups from Conti just saying like, hey, why don't we do this with just the 5 of us? Where we, with the 5 of us, are, just trying to do 3 attacks a year. We stay under the radar of law enforcement because they have to focus on the big ones. And, we're making a pretty decent living if each of the ransoms that these organizations are paying are above $1 million. And so they're impacting the ecosystem, but it's an open question on whether they are actually reducing the number of ransomware activity that we are seeing right now.
Yeah, no, it makes a lot of sense. I love to see these takedowns. I love to see them send a message. And then in many cases, we see these flows of their customers, particularly when they're kind of ransomware as a service operators, to other platforms. And you kind of wonder whether it is Hydra-esque or slowly heads are being lopped off. But this leads into another question that I think could be quite helpful to our listeners. You just touched on it there. You've really studied these people. Also have to observe that Ciaran and I decide to come up with a t-shirt. You seem to produce another book.
Yeah.
So I'm feeling
humbled,
substantially non-prolific and humbled at this point. But their business model, how they have to establish trust, even though they're criminals, particularly with this kind of greater interactive web of supply we're talking about now. Tell us what you've learned. How do these people work? Do they have any morals at all? What drives them? Are they any good, or are they just taking advantage of the things we get wrong?
James, you touched upon a really important concept here, and that's the one of trust, right? We haven't talked about that before. And they indeed need it. So in the book, I call this the ransomware trust paradox. Ransomware groups, while they need to first deceive victims, right? Deceive by writing a phishing email to get access, encrypting the data, they also need to gain their trust. They need to gain their trust because the victim needs to believe they are, first of all, reliable enough that they would actually deliver on their promise of giving the decryption keys, of not putting this data online, and also the trust that they are capable enough of actually providing a decryptor that works. Without this trust, ransomware groups cannot be profitable. So the whole question for ransomware groups is how do they overcome the ransomware trust paradox? How do they gain trust of the victim? And indeed, they do this in a number of different ways. And it's quite mimicking to what we see in legitimate businesses. So one way in which they do this is by actually showcasing their capacity. In every ransomware note today, what you will find in it is a statement, pick a sample file, whatever you want, and we will decrypt it for you for free. It's for them a way in which they can showcase that they actually have a good decryptor available. But another key way in which they do this is through reputation management and brand building.
Max, that's just completely mind-blowing to me as a little geek that's been spending time at a keyboard for the last 20 years. There used to be some malware getting thrown around the internet, broke some stuff. Some of it was commercially motivated. A lot of it was just, hacker culture. That just breaks my brain. Like, you're so right, but oh my God.
And it's not like that anymore, right? These groups flourish as a result of it on public attention. They love it when they are listed as the top 5 ransomware groups in the world. They can even put it in their ransom note and say, listen, we are one of the top ones. You have to be really afraid of us. And they will use it in their negotiations. That's a major thing.
I'm waiting for ransomware gangs to start hiring chief marketing officers, and then it's time for me to go home.
Hey, and many do have communication officers. And when we look at the Conti leaks, and when we look at who is active when, you see a lot of people just working from Monday to Friday. But their communications person and the person that also works on the leak sites, that is actually specifically in the Conti case, someone that works around the clock and works also on Saturdays and Sundays.
And Max, I remember this going back to the Coob Face gang. I think that was like 2009 or something like that. I'm scratching the back of my brain here early in my career. Seeing they had an office and they had like an office Christmas party as cybercrime started to professionalize. It's just staggering to me what you're describing, but that is the model that they're operating in. And of course, in 2023, we saw some ransomware campaigns so successful, their customer service processes broke down so that they couldn't keep up with the number of ransom requests and had to kind of delay their extortion so they could hire some more help desk operators. I'm going to stop. Sorry, I'm too upset now.
Well, a fellow broken brain will intervene now. I remember when the Clock ransomware group hacked into Move IT and they had so many victims, they actually sent out a message saying, you come forward.
Clock is another good example, right? Like having a 24/7 service with a specific dialogue for communication is telling to the victim that they're really a professional group and that you should take them serious and you should probably pay. It helps them in overcoming the trust paradox and you believing that these are serious folks that you're negotiating with.
Right. So this trust paradox. Okay. So this is mind-blowing. It's fascinating, quite depressing in many respects, but severity of it. So I'm going to valiantly try and turn this into talking about some more things about what we can do about it. So we've agreed, I think, that these brilliant law enforcement operations, they're worthwhile, but they're not a strategic solution. So I'll mention two other ideas. They're quite different. Bear with me. Number one, things like payment restrictions or bans. Are they any use? What do you think?
I think they can be of use. And we now see a UK consultation around this as well, which has been really interesting. There is one danger there with payment bans, and that is when you develop licenses for some critical entities who actually get a get out of jail card where they are allowed to pay because they are in such a high national security interest or cause so much human suffering. The problem that creates is that you then actually set a target on their back, because then they would go after exactly the most vulnerable that have that license. But I think governments should be willing to explore and test more with payment bans. May they be only for payment bans to not leak the data online? May they be for certain sectors? But I agree, as you've written before, Ciaran, that this is definitely something that deserves exploration across, though, a number of other measures that we should think about as well.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. And Australia thought about a ban, didn't go down that route, but I thought really interesting the way they faced down the Medibank hackers on data leaks. So a third of Australia's population has their medical records stolen, real fear that it's all going to be published. Australia can't compel the company not to pay, but the government puts quite a lot of pressure on it. They don't pay, and actually they contain the harm. So we can explore things like payment bans and restrictions. That's the first thing. So the second thing, bear with me, it's a big switch. Drone strikes. Now, I've seen this suggested by serious people. They're only half joking, but it's actually this Russia problem. It's the fact that they are physically immune from arrest, even if law enforcement can do takedowns and so forth. Now, covert assassinations in Russia are an interesting proposal, but can we actually take action against these people in the way that we've done for centuries against criminals? Or is it just hopeless?
It's extremely hard. And then there is an open question on against whom, right? Who are you targeting? Are you targeting those that are actually doing the operations? Or are you targeting those at the very top? And ideally, you would target those at the very top. And note that some of those industry leaders, if you may call them that way, in the ransomware space, operate quite differently. So you have someone who was at the head of Conti, a guy called Stern. He is not operating just in the ransomware business. No, his wallet has almost 100 million in it. And what he thinks about is setting up a new social media forum. He's also in the carding business. He's doing a whole bunch of things that go far beyond ransomware. I guess almost Elon Musk type.
A plethora of criminal interests.
Exactly. But some criminal and some not criminal, right? And others are, sort of diehard ransomware focused people that are only spending time in that space. And some of them have very strong, even personal connections, like Jakobets with the Russian FSB officers. Others are FSB officers themselves that we have seen with a group called Yang Luang. And others, have a relationship that we don't know about. So extremely challenging. Now, you've proposed those two. If I may propose one counter proposal on how we have to move forward, if the focus is for them on building up trust, the focus should be for us on undermining that trust. What we have done so far is treating ransomware in the same way as we have treated every state activity. Greater resilience. How can we deal with this? Take them down. No. They rely on trust. How do we undermine that? And one of the things we have to start with is thinking about how we write about them and how we communicate about them, because that builds off their branding and reputation to actually negotiate with victims. And in that sense, the Lockbit was not much more than a takedown, because what I think the team really knew very well was that they were seeking to undermine the trust that people had in Lockbit as well as in the rest of the ecosystem. It was very important for those in charge to come out in this media press release to say, Lockbit doesn't delete your data, even if you've paid. Don't trust them. Those were the messages. And that was very much because they were aware that trust plays such an important element in this ecosystem for ransomware groups. And we need to see more of this from other countries as well.
Max, I think you've been sneaking a peek at the set of notes I wrote myself for questions I wanted to ask you. I love that point. I think that's a great primer for anyone working in offensive operations against these groups, or as I said earlier, offensive-er. But I'm going to ask you the question anyway, in case you've got anything more, with your absolute freedom to reserve the right to say, I just told you that, James. And then I shall insert a second question within the question, indented with Roman numerals. Love a Roman numeral. So I wanted to ask you, do you think there are any secret weapons or plays to disrupt ransomware that the world isn't considering enough and we ought to pay more attention to, which might be what you just said, but maybe you've got something else? And little indented question with the Roman numeral, anything you think security leaders ought to pay more attention to in their own organizations based on everything we've said here? Anything you would have them, if you had a magic wand, do more of in 2025?
So let me elaborate further even on what we need to do based on the question that you set me up for, James. Think about it this way. If trust plays such an important role and we have to think about undermining it, we also have to think about how we communicate about these groups. And this is more generally what we should do about it, but also what business leaders should do about it. Now, when it comes to entities like terrorism, we have guidebooks. We know that if the terrorist incident takes place, and we would all be writing about how awful this actually plays into the hand of the terrorist group, right? They want to cause terror. And we see the same with disinformation, right? If you are giving a lot of air to a certain disinformation campaign, you might make it worse. Now, that's the same with ransomware. Now, with these other two, we have guidelines, we have principles, we have journalists that think about when you should and how you should write about these groups. How should the cyber threat intel community engage with these groups? How should we publish about these groups in a different way than we should do for your typical APTs, advanced persistent threats, right? None of that exists for ransomware. And so if you ask me what should be the next thing, it should actually be us, self-reflective across the entire community about thinking about how we want to engage with those people in the future and how much do we want to actually help them in building up reputation and brand that helps them, again, overcome the ransomware trust paradox. And then for the general business leader, what we see is an even greater need to indeed think about this communication plan, a communication plan that is much more than a press release. But I would say, particularly for critical infrastructure entities, please do make that contact with some of those journalists even prior to a ransomware attack. Or at least with, your national TV stations, if you were a big entity. Why? Well, because, it's important that they, for instance, don't disclose this information whilst negotiations are still going on, because it would only put further pressure on you as an entity that has to deal with the impact that this ransomware incident has had. So there is also a communication element here for the entities, especially the larger ones that can reach out more directly to the media landscape that we have today.
Ciaran, we have a wonderful problem.
We have a wonderful, terrible problem.
Fantastic point, great points. I love those and things we can action. I love the playbook point too. On the other hand, he read ahead on my notes.
You've messed up our agenda.
And he's done the takeaway as well now, Ciaran. He doesn't even have the notes. How is he doing this?
I think he might have done a cyber operation against us because, as everyone knows who listens to this show, we finish with our 30-second takeaway. But you've just told us a really interesting point that I hadn't heard mentioned before in all the debates about ransomware. Actually, be careful how you talk about this, how you hype them up. Their branding, don't rebrand them or don't reinforce the brand. Absolutely fantastic point. So what do we do now?
I've got an idea, actually, Ciaran.
Okay.
A final demand.
Okay, here we go.
I mean, a politely phrased question.
Oh, come on. Go on.
Cheeky, Ciaran. What's your point? Well, look, I think, Max, instead I'm going to ask you this. You get 30 seconds to get your crystal ball out. Think about the next few years. Give us a prediction for something you think is going to change that's going to be consequential. It could be cyber criminal tactics. It could be something from their playbook. It could be something in the world of technology. AI-driven ransomware starts the Terminator wars. I don't know. 30 seconds of prediction. And one day we'll invite you back to grade you on it. How's that sound, Ciaran? Do we like this plan?
I love it.
All right, Max, have I padded it for enough time for you to think about something?
Sure. So I think one of the big things for ransomware groups right now is to think about all the data that they've acquired, and they have very little time to make sense of it and then develop a negotiation plan with the victim. But the LLM and AI space today will change that dramatically in the years to come, where they very quickly can summarize the data that they have previously acquired. It puts them in a negotiation position that they previously didn't have, and what we hopefully will not see, but I expect we will. are ransomware groups that have that in order and can very quickly say, hey, we've done a summary, an automatic summary of all the data that you have, all of the key things across your enterprise. We have this, and this. We know that this is this much worth, this is this much worth, this is this much worth. Please pay us this much. And it's that type of information gap that we previously saw that was massively to the advantage of the victim, but I fear that information gap will shrink in the years to come.
Brilliant. Max, that was a proper tour de force. We've worked you very, very hard. Thank you so much. I will not attempt to summarize that awesome contribution. Instead, I will just finish by saying, if you want to understand state cyber operations, read No Shortcuts. And if you want to understand the pressing emergency that is ransomware as a national security threat, go out and buy Ransomware. Max Smeets, thank you so much.
Thank you, Max. Awesome.
It was a real pleasure, and looking forward to season 2.
Absolutely. And then season 3, when we come back and we learn if Max was correct in his predictions and we ask him to get his crystal ball out. And if he's right, he's going to buy me a lottery ticket. But for today, Ciaran, I think that's it, isn't it?
That is indeed it. So all that remains is to ask, as usual, for feedback.
Feedback, yes, very important. Whatever's keeping you awake at night or some topic you'd like to hear about, we want to know about it, don't we, Ciaran?
We do. So leave us feedback at the podcast site, or you can email us at cyberleaderspodcast@sans.org. Tell us what you'd like to hear more of, less of, anything you like.
And with that, thank you everyone for listening.
Thank you for listening. Keep cybering. From me, Ciaran Martin.
And from me, James Line.
It's goodbye.
And toodle pip.